Long shot. The spring and fall of the USFL. All my life, I've believed in paying for the best. But when it came to the United States Football League, I decided to go a different route entirely. By the time I bought the New Jersey Generals in the fall of 1983, the league was already failing badly. It had lost nearly $30 million. The Generals alone, under the ownership of an Oklahoma oilman named J. Walter Duncan, had lost more than $2 million, not to mention nearly every game they'd played. In real estate terms, I was buying the South Bronx instead of 5th Avenue and 57th Street. But I didn't look at the Generals as a typical deal. I viewed it instead as a long shot, a lark that I could afford to take. I've always been a football fan. I love sports, and having my own team seemed the realization of a great fantasy. I also liked the idea of taking on the NFL, a smug, self-satisfied monopoly that I believed was highly vulnerable to an aggressive competitor. As long shots go, I liked the odds on the USFL. My initial investment was relatively small, and the potential rewards were quite great. For less than $6 million, contingent on the league's continuing compared with the $70 million an NFL franchise might cost, I was able to purchase a professional football team in one of the greatest areas of the world. If I could help turn the team and the league around, I stood to earn back many times my initial investment. At the very least, I would have a lot of fun trying. The main problems with the USFL seemed fairly clear-cut and not all that difficult to remedy. The first was that the league was playing its games in the spring. Sports have their seasons, and fans like their football in the fall. The television networks, which essentially underwrite professional sports, won't pay large sums for the rights to televise spring football. At the time I bought the Generals, ABC was paying $1 million a year for exclusive network rights to the USFL spring schedule. Meanwhile, the three networks together were paying a staggering $359 million a year for rights to the NFL fall games. The first thing the USFL had to do was move to the fall. The second challenge was to build a first-class product. To me, that meant spending whatever money it took to sign top players, promote our teams, and create the sort of excitement that would make us a legitimate competitor for the NFL's fans and TV dollars. 2 leagues had been launched previously in competition with the NFL, and the outcome in each case was highly instructive. The American Football League was formed in 1962 by 8 very wealthy entrepreneurial men. They signed top players and absorbed substantial losses in the service of building the league's credibility during the early years. By 1966, the AFL had signed away dozens of the NFL's best players and was widely seen as the more exciting of the 2 leagues. With the AFL raids escalating, NFL Commissioner Pete Rozelle surrendered. He suggested a merger of the 2 leagues, and today, those original AFL teams are among the NFL's most successful franchises. But even without a merger, the AFL would have prospered. The other venture that tried to compete with the NFL was the World Football League. It was launched in 1973, but by men of much less wealth and more limited vision. In contrast to their AFL counterparts, the WFL owners signed very few name players, placed their franchises in smaller cities, and failed to attract any kind of television contract. Within 2 years, the WFL was bankrupt. Its founders didn't lose a fortune, but only because they didn't invest a fortune. I foresaw 2 possible outcomes if we moved the USFL to the fall and began to build quality teams, and both of them were potentially good. The first was that at least one of the 3 networks would offer us a substantial fall television contract, which would help us continue to build an even stronger league, fully competitive with the NFL. The second was that the 3 networks, all fearful of alienating the monopoly NFL, would refuse to give us a fall television contract, no matter how strong a product we had to offer. In that case, I believed we'd have strong grounds for an antitrust case against the NFL. If we went the latter route, obviously we could lose, and then our league would be dead. But I believed the more likely outcome was some sort of victory. If the suit went to a jury and we were awarded reasonable damages, particularly given the fact that any damage award is trebled in an antitrust case, we'd have the financial base we needed. Another possibility was that the NFL, anticipating a costly and humiliating court defeat, would offer some sort of settlement, much as they'd done 20 years earlier with the AFL. I made no secret of my views. 2 years later, the NFL would try to claim in court that my plan to move our league season to the fall was somehow secret and sinister. In fact, within days of taking over the Generals, I told any reporter who called me exactly how I felt. Then, on October 18, 1983, a month after purchasing the Generals, I attended my first owners' meeting in Houston, Texas. I wasn't shy there either. When my turn came to address my fellow owners, I stood up and explained that I hadn't bought into the USFL to be a minor league owner playing in the off-season of spring. I pointed out that the greatest number of fans and by far the biggest pool of network television dollars were concentrated in the fall. I reminded my fellow owners that because the NFL had just gone through a long, bitter players' strike in the past fall, my fans were feeling restless and alienated. And finally, I argued that we had a chance to put the NFL even further on the defensive by moving aggressively to sign top NFL players whose contracts were coming up, as well as the best graduating college players. If there was a single key miscalculation I made with the USFL, it was evaluating the strength of my fellow owners. In any partnership, you're only as strong as your weakest link. Several of my fellow USFL owners were strong as hell financially and psychologically. Among them were Michigan Panthers owner Al Taubman and Philadelphia Stars owner Miles Tannenbaum, both of whom, coincidentally, had made their personal fortunes building shopping centers, as well as Memphis Showboats owner Billy Dunavalt and Jacksonville Bulls owner Fred Bullard. Unfortunately, I quickly discovered that a number of USFL owners lacked the financial resources and the competitive vision to build the sort of top-quality league necessary to defeat the NFL. They shuddered at the prospect of any direct confrontation with the NFL. They were quite content to play in obscurity in the spring, and they spent much more time thinking about ways to keep their costs down than about how to build the league up. My most immediate priority was the team I'd just purchased. The New Jersey Generals were a disaster. They'd just come off a season in which they'd won only 4 games and lost 14. The team had one great athlete and superstar, Herschel Walker, the Heisman Trophy running back from Georgia, but even Herschel had yet to play near his potential. Meanwhile, although the Generals had just completed a full season of playing professional football across the river from the media capital of the world, they had attracted virtually no press attention and very few fans. The best way to turn that around was to turn the Generals around. Fans like winners. They come to watch stars, great exciting players who do great exciting things. Herschel was obviously one. But in football, the team rises or falls on the quarterback. Nothing helped promote the AFL and the New York Jets as much as the signing of a University of Alabama quarterback named Joe Namath for a then unprecedented $400,000 a year. Namath eventually led the Jets and the AFL to their first Super Bowl victory, but even before that, he earned his salary simply because he became the AFL's most colorful, charismatic drawing card. The first player I went after was Brian Sipe, the quarterback for the Cleveland Browns. Sipe had been the NFL's most valuable player a couple of seasons earlier, and he was a bona fide superstar. He was also in the option year of his contract, meaning that he'd be available in a matter of months. Getting Sipe was a chance to help the Generals and the USFL and simultaneously to hurt the NFL. The negotiations proved to be long and difficult, but on December 27, 1983, I held a press conference to announce we'd signed Sipe to a long-term $800,000 a year contract with the Generals. By the time we got Sipe, we'd already lured away several other top NFL players. The first was Gary Barbaro, an all-pro free safety from the Kansas City Chiefs, whom we signed on November 5. Signing Barbaro had a side benefit. It showed other NFL players that we were serious about paying top dollar to build a top team. On November 28, we signed Kerry Justin, who'd been a starting cornerback for the Seattle Seahawks. In December, we signed a pair of linebackers from the Super Bowl champion San Francisco 49ers, Willie Harper and Bobby Leopold. To protect Sipe, we signed a veteran offensive guard from Cincinnati named Dave Lapham. Another negotiation that got some attention during that period was the one I conducted with Don Shula, coach of the Miami Dolphins. Shula was one of the most successful coaches in NFL history, but he was also vastly underpaid. I immediately offered Shula far more than he'd been earning. I was willing to meet most of his demands, but when he threw in a request for an apartment in Trump Tower, I drew the line. I can afford to buy football teams in part because I don't give away apartments. Still, the negotiation ended up helping Shula. It forced the Dolphins to renegotiate his contract at a far higher salary, which he certainly deserved. We got the most attention of all for signing Lawrence Taylor, the all-pro linebacker for the New York Giants and perhaps the best all-around player in the NFL. On December 31, 1983, we announced that Taylor had signed a 4-year contract with the Generals for a total of $3.25 million. The catch was that it wouldn't take effect until 1988, when his contract with the Giants expired. In a way that was even better than getting him immediately. By signing a player of Taylor's stature to a futures contract, we were serving notice on the NFL that none of their players, not even those under multi-year contracts, were beyond our reach. As it turned out, when Taylor's deal was announced, the Giants went nuts. 2 weeks later, on January 17, 1984, they offered him a 6-year, $6.55 million extension of his contract. In effect, I forced the Giants to increase Taylor's salary by $3 million just to prevent him from departing 3 years down the road. Then, in return for my letting Taylor out of his Generals contract, the Giants agreed to pay me a penalty fee of $750,000. My aggressiveness in signing NFL players also seemed to inspire other USFL owners. The second USFL draft was held on January 4, 1984. The Pittsburgh franchise drafted Heisman Trophy winner Mike Rozier from Nebraska and signed him 5 days later. The team's season ticket sales immediately jumped from 6,000 to 20,000. Brigham Young quarterback Steve Young, a college superstar, signed a multi-million-dollar contract with the USFL's Los Angeles Express. Don Klosterman, the president of the LA Express, also managed to sign 14 other draft picks, every one of whom was a good NFL prospect. Altogether, USFL teams signed nearly half of the top college players we went after. Sports Illustrated posted the obvious question in an article about the success of our draft. How many more players like Rozier and Young can the NFL afford to lose? When our owners met in New Orleans on January 17, I pushed again to move our season to the fall. Given our success in luring NFL players and signing top college prospects, the time couldn't have been better. I suggested a fall vote right then and there, but the reluctant owners managed to vote through a compromise instead, appointing a long-range planning committee to study the spring-fall question. To me, committees are what insecure people create in order to put off making hard decisions, but at least I'd gotten the fall question on the table as a serious issue. I was made a member of the new committee, and I was confident I'd ultimately persuade a majority of owners that the fall was our best hope. Meanwhile, the NFL was beginning to run scared. The best evidence was a meeting the league held in Cambridge, Massachusetts, in February 1984 to discuss its future and specifically the threat of the USFL. The main seminar, which we didn't learn about until much later, was conducted by a highly respected Harvard Business School professor named Michael Porter, who had prepared a 47-page document entitled The USFL versus the NFL. Some 65 NFL executives attended his presentation, among them Jack Donlin, executive director of the NFL Management Council, as well as numerous team owners. Porter bluntly outlined a multi-part plan for declaring total war on our league by employing numerous anti-competitive strategies. His 2.5-hour presentation was divided into sections such as offensive strategies, guerrilla warfare, and the art of war, China 500 BC. Porter's suggestions included trying to dissuade ABC from continuing even its spring television contract with the USFL, encouraging USFL players to unionize in order to drive up our costs, and attempting to co-opt the most powerful and influential USFL owners by offering them NFL franchises. As we launched our second season in the spring of 1984, we weren't yet aware of the NFL's secret campaign to destroy us, but we were probably feeling its effects. Several of our more vulnerable owners, most particularly those in Chicago, Washington, San Antonio, and Oklahoma, had begun to experience several financial problems. The danger to the league was less losing a couple of franchises than having our credibility damaged. As long as we had problems, it was difficult to get the press to focus on our stronger teams. Instead, sports writers wrote about declining attendance in the weaker cities and the personal financial problems some owners were having. Meanwhile, as I feared, the long-range planning study dragged on. A majority of owners had voted to hire an outside consultant, McKinsey & Company, to conduct the study. McKinsey is probably the best in its business, but I like consultants even less than I like committees. When it comes to making a smart decision, the most distinguished planning committee working with the highest priced consultants doesn't hold a candle to a group of guys with a reasonable amount of common sense and their own money on the line. McKinsey's study took 3 months and cost of princely $600,000. Finally, on the morning of August 22, 1984, McKinsey executive Sharon Patrick presented her conclusions to the USFL owners who had gathered in Chicago. The league's best hope, she told us, was to continue to play in the spring, to limit expenditures severely, and perhaps to consider a move to the fall somewhere down the line. Among other things, she reported that a majority of fans who'd been surveyed in a poll wanted the USFL to stay in the spring. You can probably guess how much stock I put in polls. The reality was that we just couldn't afford to adopt the McKinsey conclusions. Even if we cut our losses in the spring, there was no foreseeable chance of making a profit, and a lot of our weaker owners couldn't afford to lose another dime. We needed to take radical action, and that's what I stood up and said. Within 2 hours of Patrick's presentation, I managed to get the issue of moving to the fall put to a vote. It passed by more than the required 2/3 majority. That same afternoon, we announced the decision to take effect following one last spring season. The other thing we began to discuss at the meeting was bringing an antitrust suit against the NFL. Specifically, we authorized our commissioner, Chet Simmons, to send NFL Commissioner Pete Rozelle a letter putting the NFL on notice. Simmons stated our views gently. The position of the USFL as a news sports enterprise and the market position of the NFL make it essential to the survival of the USFL that the NFL and the NFL owners operate within the bounds of the laws and regulations which govern the conduct of business, having a dominant market position. Put more bluntly, our message was this: if you try to hurt us, we'll sue you. By October, it was clear that something had changed dramatically in the tenor of our discussions with CBS and NBC. So long as we were just considering a move to the fall, both networks seemed interested in discussing a deal. No sooner did we announce our move, however, than they both backed off totally. It was obvious to me that the NFL was putting enormous pressure on the networks not to do business with us in the fall, particularly on ABC, with whom we already had a contract for the spring. Pete Rozelle later testified that he'd never discussed the issue with Roone Aldridge, the head of ABC Sports. To me, that was preposterous. Rozelle and Aldridge are longtime colleagues and good friends. Would anyone seriously believe that Rozelle, highly concerned about the implications of the USFL's move to the fall, wouldn't make his views known to his friend Aldridge? And is it really possible that Aldridge, a man who made millions of dollars for ABC by inventing NFL Monday Night Football, wouldn't be highly concerned with keeping Rozelle happy? The irony is that all three networks, not just ABC, but NBC and CBS as well, were actually losing money on NFL games. After total rights fees in excess of $350 million a year, the networks, by their own estimates, lost many millions televising games during 1985. Even so, no network wanted to risk alienating the NFL. Football is the prestige TV sport, and in order to remain competitive with one another, the three networks were resigned to carrying the NFL as a loss leader. As for the USFL, we were left with no option. On October 17, 1984, we filed an antitrust suit in the Southern District Court of New York. Specifically, we asked that the NFL be limited to contracts with no more than 2 of the networks, and that we be awarded damages of $1.32 billion. In the meantime, we had a more immediate problem: staying alive. On January 3, 1985, the USFL held its third draft of college seniors. While the Generals had improved greatly to 9-5 and averaged more than 400,000 fans a game, other teams were failing more deeply into the red. We very much needed a shot in the arm. My own solution was to go after the best and most exciting college senior. There was little doubt who that was. Doug Flutie of Boston College was a lock to win the Heisman Trophy. In his final game, playing against the University of Miami on national television, Flutie capped his career by throwing a last-second 50-yard bomb for a touchdown, giving Boston College a 47-45 victory. Very quickly, the pass became one of those instant replay classics, transforming Flutie into an overnight sports legend. I must have seen the pass at least 24 times on various newscasts and sports shows. I also liked the fact that Flutie had great media potential. He was good-looking, well-spoken, and gutsy, the sort of guy the press loves to write about. There were two minor problems. One was that the Generals already had a very talented quarterback named Brian Sipe. The other was that Doug Flutie stood just 5 feet 10 and weighed only 170 pounds. A number of scouts were skeptical that he could make in the pros, where virtually every defensive lineman is 6 feet 6 and weighs at least 260 pounds. In the end, I went with my instincts. Brian Sipe was a proven star, but he was also 35 years old, and his best years were probably behind him. Doug Flutie, on the other hand, had the potential to become the USFL's Joe Namath. In the worst case, he'd generate a lot of press, which would help the Generals' season ticket sales and the image of the league generally. In the best case, he'd be a great player too. On February 5, we signed Flutie to a 5-year contract at over $1 million a year, which I personally guaranteed. I don't like to do that, but a player of Flutie's stature wasn't about to risk signing with a financially shaky league unless he had some guarantees. If the league ever did go under, I figured I could sell his contract to an NFL team. On February 6, I solved the issue of Brian Sipe by trading him to the Jacksonville Bulls. I wasn't about to have a very highly paid quarterback sitting on the bench. Flutie made his debut on February 24 in an away game against the Birmingham Stallions. He started slow but came on very strong and almost pulled out a victory by leading the Generals to 3 touchdowns in the fourth quarter. As for his box office value, it was even greater than I expected. The game was televised by ABC and drew a 9 rating, nearly twice what we'd averaged the previous season. 2 other notable events occurred that first weekend of the season, both having to do with quarterbacks. One was the opening game performance of a quarterback named Jim Kelly of the Houston Gamblers. Kelly threw for 574 yards and 5 touchdowns, proving that he was as good as any quarterback in either league. Unfortunately, the other quarterback news was not good. Brian Sipe, playing his first game for Jacksonville, suffered a separated shoulder, which seems almost certain to end his season, and perhaps his career. On March 10, we had our home opener against the LA Express. If I had to pick a high point for the USFL, it was probably that game. Over 60,000 fans turned up, anticipating a duel between the newcomer Flutie and the USFL's best proven quarterback Steve Young. Both players put on dazzling shows, and better yet, the Generals came out on top. Flutie threw for 2 fourth-quarter touchdowns to give us the victory 35-24. The day after Flutie's great game, I wrote a letter to Harry Usher, our new commissioner, suggesting that the cost of Flutie's contract be shared among all USFL owners on the grounds that Flutie's promotional value was league-wide. I knew it was highly unlikely that the other owners would go along, and they didn't, but my attitude is that you can't get hurt asking. Flutie, Kelly, and Young represented the good news about the USFL. The bad news was that we were still stuck with a lot of weak teams led by mediocre quarterbacks. My worst fears about the consequences of having weak partners came true midway through our 1985 season. John Bassett was the owner of the USFL franchise in Tampa Bay. Previously, he'd been one of the founders of the ill-fated World Football League. From the very start, Bassett and I had been on opposite sides of nearly every issue, and specifically the move to the fall. I'd managed to bring the majority of my fellow owners over to my way of thinking, but Bassett never stopped fighting me, though he finally, reluctantly, did vote with the majority. Despite our disagreements, I liked him personally, and I felt sympathetic to his situation. On the Sunday afternoon in late March, it was widely known within the league that Bassett had cancer, that he was fighting for his life, and that his behavior had become increasingly unpredictable during the previous few months. What I'll never know is whether Bassett's illness affected his judgment that day. In any case, Bassett agreed to be interviewed by ABC announcer Keith Jackson, who began by asking what he thought was wrong with the USFL. What followed was a tirade. Before a national TV audience, Bassett viciously criticized the concept of moving the USFL to the fall. He called the league its own worst enemy. He said that the USFL was guilty of mismanagement and virtually every other horrible sin he could conjure up. I caught the interview on a TV monitor in the press box, and I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My first thought was that Bassett would make a great witness for the NFL in our antitrust suit. My second thought was that he was just a terribly frustrated man, thoughtlessly venting anger. If any one person had the potential to offset the damage wrought by Bassett and our other weaker owners, it was probably Harvey Myerson, the attorney we hired in the middle of 1985 to take over our antitrust case. Myerson was the head of the litigation department at the firm Finley Cumble, and he was an expert in antitrust litigation. He also had the sort of pugnacious, confrontational attitude you need when you're the underdog taking on the establishment. Most of the other USFL owners had long since written off the possibility that we'd win the antitrust case. The NFL, they believed, was just too entrenched. But from the first time Myerson met us in April 1985, he told us he felt we had a very strong case. He said that we should pull out all the stops to bring it into trial and that there was a better-than-ever chance we'd win. In the meantime, one bright spot amidst all the USFL's troubles was the fact that the Generals, and specifically Herschel Walker, were playing so well. For the first 2 weeks of the season, Herschel simply wasn't being utilized. He'd call me up in my office depressed and say, "Mr. Trump, I can run over these guys if they just give me the ball." I ranted and raved to our coach, Walt Michaels, but it wasn't until I literally threatened to fire him that he got the point. In the 7th game of the season, Herschel was finally let loose. He ran the ball 30 times for almost 250 yards, setting a league record. In each of the next 10 games, he ran for more than 100 yards. By the end of the season, he'd racked up 2,411 yards. That broke the all-time professional football rushing record, held previously by Eric Dickerson of the NFL. I got a great kick out of that. Unfortunately, Doug Flutie was injured late in the 1985 season, and that almost certainly cost us the USFL championship. In the playoffs, we lost by 3 points to the transplanted Baltimore Stars, while Flutie stood on the sidelines. In February 1986, we agreed to reduce the number of USFL teams from 14 to 8. In the process, we weeded out the owners with the biggest financial problems. We also consolidated our strengths. The Houston Gamblers, for example, merged with my Generals. As a result, we created a dream backfield that I'm convinced had no equal in professional football. Herschel Walker at running back and Jim Kelly at quarterback. The other teams that survived the consolidation were also all among our strongest and most popular: Memphis, Baltimore, Jacksonville, Tampa, Orlando, Arizona, and Birmingham. In April, we got more good news when a federal judge named Peter Leisure set a jury trial to begin the next month in our antitrust suit against the NFL. That ensured us a verdict before the start of our first fall season. If we won the suit, we'd be in great shape to launch. If we lost, I considered it highly unlikely that the USFL could survive, but at least we'd finally be able to cut our losses. The future of the USFL now rested in the hands of the 6 jurors chosen to hear our case. The jury system is designed to ensure the fairest possible trial. The problem is that a pool of randomly selected jurors isn't necessarily qualified to make judgments on complicated issues. Sometimes that isn't bad, particularly if you have a case that's weak and a lawyer who is very persuasive. The problem is unpredictability. You can have a great case and come out a loser, and you can have a terrible case but come out a winner. We got to present our side first, and very quickly, a consensus formed in the courtroom that Harvey Myerson was beating the living daylights out of the NFL. He put Commissioner Pete Rozelle on the stand and almost literally took him apart. For 26 years, Rozelle had been running the NFL very successfully and very smoothly. Of course, you don't have to be a genius to run a monopoly. Put that same man up against a tough competitor, and it may be a whole different story. Myerson pressed, and Rozelle got flustered. He mumbled, stumbled, and spoke badly. He turned red, and he took back statements. At times, he appeared to be flat out lying. Halfway through his week of cross-examination, Rozelle had become physically sick. His performance was so weak that I found myself actually feeling sorry for him. In retrospect, however, I realized that the jury probably felt at least as sorry for Rozelle as I did, and that may well have helped save the NFL's case. Rozelle was least credible, I thought, when he talked about the Harvard seminar entitled The USFL versus the NFL, the linchpin of our case. Rozelle claimed he hadn't known anything about the seminar and that he got physically ill when he first heard about it weeks after the fact. "To your stomach, sir?" asked Harvey Myerson, totally deadpan. "Yes," said Rozelle. "I see," said Myerson. How long did it take you to recover? About half a day, Rozelle replied. I doubt that a single person in the courtroom believed Rozelle during that exchange. At another point, Myerson introduced some devastatingly incriminating comments that Rozelle had made before a congressional committee back in 1961. At the time, the NFL's games were being shown on just one network, CBS. If all the networks were tied up by one football league, a senator asked Rozelle during his testimony, wouldn't the other league possibly be at a major competitive disadvantage? I should certainly think so, Rozelle said, quickly adding, there is no intention on our part of using more than one network. By 1987, of course, the NFL had all three networks tied up. Didn't that put our league at a major competitive disadvantage? Rozelle could only hem and haw. The one time I myself directly contradicted Rozelle's testimony was over his description of a meeting the two of us had in March 1984. At the time, the USFL owners were still debating whether to move to the fall. The Porter Seminar at Harvard had taken place several weeks earlier, and one of Porter's main strategies for destroying the USFL had been to try to co-opt the strongest USFL franchise owners by promising us NFL franchises. At Rozelle's suggestion, I rented a suite at the Pierre Hotel for a meeting on March 12. I like to keep every option open in life, and I was certainly interested in what the commissioner of the NFL had on his mind. Rozelle testified at the trial that during our meeting, I told him I was interested in purchasing an NFL franchise and that I'd get out of the USFL if I could get into the NFL. It was ridiculous on the face of it. I never had any interest in owning a football franchise outside of the New York area, and I had long since determined that neither of the two New York-based NFL teams, the Giants or the Jets, was up for sale. What really happened at the meeting is that Rozelle tried to woo me, plain and simple. He said he considered me a good candidate for an NFL franchise, whether it was the Generals through merger, or an NFL team which he said he could help me get. In return, he said he wanted two things, that the USFL not move to the fall, and that the league not bring an antitrust suit against the NFL. I had no doubt about what Rozelle was up to. He was testing the waters. If he could get rid of the USFL merely by absorbing a couple of our teams into the NFL, he was prepared to do that, I'm certain. At the same time, by merely dangling an offer, he gave himself deniability in the event that I turned him down. That's exactly what I did. Sure enough, he rewrote the story of our meeting. We called 18 witnesses in all during the first month of the trial, and we scored a lot of points. Myerson showed how the NFL had bullied the three networks into refusing to consider giving the USFL a TV contract. He showed why the USFL could not survive without such a contract. He offered endless evidence, led by the Porter study, that the NFL had consciously and illegally set out to destroy the USFL. By the time we'd finished presenting our witnesses, even the press was beginning to sense the possibility that we might win the case. The headline of a story in Sports Illustrated caught the mood best. Give the first round to the USFL, it said, followed by an even more devastating subhead. The embattled younger league has scored tellingly against the NFL in the trial of its $1.32 billion antitrust suit. Now the NFL has the ball. Looking back, I think our strength may have backfired, just as the NFL's weakness ended up prompting the jury's sympathy. Myerson's style, the silk handkerchief in the pocket of his perfectly tailored suit, his theatrical way of speaking, the methodical relentlessness of his attack, may have come off as too aggressive and too slick. By contrast, I think the NFL came off as the beleaguered underdogs. Like Rozelle, who became sick and was so unconvincing during his cross-examination, the NFL lawyer, Frank Rothman, was so weak and ashen-faced to the last days of the trial that everyone, including me, felt very bad for him. Many didn't even believe he would be able to finish, and in fact he was rushed to a hospital for a major operation shortly after the trial's conclusion. I believe Rothman's troubles elicited further sympathy from the jury. I was part of the problem. As a witness, I was well-spoken and professional, I think, very much a contrast to Pete Rozelle. But that probably played into the NFL's hands. From day one, the NFL painted me as a vicious, greedy, Machiavellian billionaire, intent only on serving my selfish ends at everyone else's expense. The USFL, attorney Frank Rothman told the jury in his opening remarks, is controlled and dominated by Donald Trump, who can buy and sell many of the owners in the NFL. In truth, of course, the wealthy, powerful NFL owners cowered only to the extent that it served their ends. In retrospect, we might have been better off to put on the witness stand several of the smaller USFL owners who'd lost their shirts and had genuinely sad stories to tell. The other way the NFL beat us was in pure public relations. I've got to give this to Rozelle. He's always been great at promoting his league. His chief spokesman is a guy named Joe Brown, and Rozelle deserves credit for using him well. After each day's testimony, Brown would go to the halls and lobby the press masterfully, telling them what a great day it had just been for the NFL. It drove me crazy. I'd say to Harry Usher, our commissioner, "Why aren't you out lobbying the press?" And he'd say, "That isn't important. It's the jury we've got to convince." Unfortunately, that's not the way it works. Although the jury is instructed not to read any newspaper coverage or watch any television reports about the trial, it's nearly impossible to resist reading about a case you're part of, particularly one that's getting massive attention. Even if some jurors did resist, they undoubtedly heard about the trial coverage from their friends and family. Why else, after all, would Rozelle assign Joe Brown to lobby reporters every day for 6 weeks? For all that, when the jury finally began deliberations on July 25, 1986, I was convinced we'd made the more effective case and that they'd find in our favor. What I never anticipated was that we could win and end up losing anyway. After 4 days of deliberation, the 6-member jury concluded on July 29 that the NFL had violated antitrust laws by conspiring to monopolize professional football and that they did illegally damage the USFL. But then they voted to award us only a token $1 in damages. It was a hollow victory. Without damages, the decision had no teeth since the NFL didn't get punished for breaking the law. When the jurors were interviewed by reporters immediately after the verdict was announced, it turned out that they'd been deeply divided. At least 2 of them had wanted to award us substantial damages. One, a school teacher named Miriam Sanchez, had favored giving us damages of $300 million, but said that she'd misunderstood the mechanism for doing so. "I didn't understand the instructions," she told reporters, "so I had to put my faith in the judge, hoping he would give the USFL more money." I wasn't happy about the outcome, but in a way, I was relieved. My attitude is that you do your best, and if it doesn't work, you move on to the next thing. By the time the trial took place, I had lost quite a lot of money on the generals, and the USFL had lost many times my number. Without the prospect of a fall network television contract, there wasn't any point in investing more money. Most of my fellow owners agreed. 1 week after the decision, the USFL owners met and voted to suspend the season. At the same time, we voted to appeal the jury's ruling. Unfortunately, the fans come out the biggest losers. The NFL's monopoly power is secure again, and the owners have less reason than ever to consider adding new teams in cities that have long been seeking franchises. Meanwhile, the best USFL players had been picked up by NFL teams. Herschel Walker was signed by the Dallas Cowboys. Because I'd personally guaranteed Walker's contract, he could have collected $1.2 million from me for each of the next 6 years and never played football. But Herschel's a competitor and the money was secondary. As it turned out, I made a very good deal with Dallas. They could have refused to pay for his big contract, but figuring that Dallas was under intense fan pressure to sign Herschel, I told them I was interested in letting Herschel go only if they picked up the full cost of his contract. Sure enough, they agreed. It was good for me, it was good for Herschel, and it's even turned out to be good for Dallas. Herschel joined the team in August, and although he had virtually no time to practice, he finished the season as the Cowboys' leading combined rushing and receiving yardage gainer. Jim Kelly also immediately became a star as quarterback for the Buffalo Bills. Freddie Gilbert, one of our defensive linemen, went to Atlanta and established himself as one of the team's best players. Even Doug Flutie, who everyone said was too small for the NFL, was signed by the Chicago Bears. Dozens of USFL players were signed to NFL contracts, and many have become stars on their new teams. Watching players like Herschel Walker and Jim Kelly play in the NFL does sometimes make me wish our league could have survived. I'm convinced that if the USFL had played last season, the Generals would have fielded one of the best teams in professional football. Not that I've ever given up entirely. I'm a big believer in comebacks, and the USFL is appealing this ridiculous verdict. In recent months, I've received numerous calls from a very smart, very persistent guy who is trying to put together an entirely new fall league. He wants me to take the New York franchise, and I'm seriously considering it.